So anyway, folks, I'm Parker Elmore from Odyssey Advisors. Many of you guys know me. You heard me speak at a lot of these various things on pensions, OPEB, investments, and God knows whatever else. And so we, Liz Farmer, we came across a couple months ago. I would love to claim credit, but Stephanie on our team does a lot of research. So when you guys get these newsletters all the time, all this information, I have precious little to do with those things. Our team does all the hard work and gives me all the credit. But anyway, so Stephanie came across Liz, and she's really a policy expert on fiscal matters, does national audience reporting, state, local governments, where they spend their money, fiscal distress, tax policy, pensions. We got to work OPEB in there because OPEB is more important than pensions on the balance sheet, but we'll leave that alone. Contributes to Forbes, Route 150s, done some Wall Street Journal stuff in the past. So she does a lot of stuff, and a lot more important stuff than I do as far as this fiscal government stuff does. So I'd rather have her kind of talk to you guys about this stuff and kind of give you guys, if you try to make clear in the front end, how do we prevent surprise disaster in 12 to 18 months, when the money runs out? And I was concerned about it because I talked to a couple of you guys last week, but I see all the census files that I get every year, and I go, I'm looking, the school populations have been increasing fairly dramatically on the hiring side, which I know that the money's not going to be there in 12 to 18 months. So I go, are you going to lay off all these teachers in 12 months? And I know some of you guys say, no, we haven't done that. And they're, well, I don't know. The census file tells me otherwise. So anyway, with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Liz and let her hopefully give you guys some education. And again, drop your questions in the chat, drop your questions in the Q&A, and I'll share a copy of her presentation in the chat so you can catch up with it later. And it's all yours, Liz.
All right, thanks, Parker. Well, as Parker said, I'm a fiscal policy writer and analyst. I've been in the field for a long time now, it feels like. I come to it by way of journalism. I was a journalist for many years and still am to some degree, but I also do a lot of policy writing. Have spent the last decade or so covering state and local fiscal policy on a national level. And so what I bring to you today is sort of my look at what's going on and what to expect for the next at least for the end of 2023. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen and hope that everything turns out okay. All right, so it looks like, okay, so we're good. So, but I started off on the wrong slide. I don't know how that happens. Okay, so as I mentioned, I am a fiscal policy writer. We can go ahead. So the big takeaway, I always like to start off with this because if you get nothing else from me, just remember this. Revenues have been great for states and localities for the last several years. That's due to a number of reasons, but everyone's in agreement that those times have come to an end. States are fiscally in a much better position than a lot of localities. That usually tends to be the case. States at least have the choice of reducing local aid. Localities have the choice of cutting services or raising taxes. There's no one else they can kind of roll that particular decision on down to. So, so this is the big picture, is that localities are struggling with a lot more things than I think states are on that level. And remote work, certainly in larger cities, is kind of like its own little category of stuff to deal with. Okay, so I just want to give you guys an overview of what we're going to cover. I'm going to spend most of the time talking about these issues to watch. Again, revenue slowing. As Parker mentioned, there's an ARPA fiscal cliff coming up. Downtowns in cities are particularly affected by what's going on with the changing trends in remote work. And then I want to talk a little bit about climate risk. You could almost call it at this point a sleeper issue because hurricane season hasn't started yet, honestly. And when it does, people will talk more about it again. But there are other sleeper issues that I will go over very quickly, and then just kind of share some thoughts about some positive things and some things to watch out for looking ahead. And I just wanted to include a cartoon because the federal government always has the option, even though it tends to be contested when there's a split Congress between when Republicans take the House, and if there's a Democratic president, the debt ceiling almost always tends to get argued over. But the feds can operate at a deficit until the cows come home. States and localities cannot. Every single state, except for Vermont, technically, is constitutionally bound to have a to pass a balanced budget. Vermont does so because it's obviously the smart thing to do. A lot of cities are also mandated in their charter to pass a balanced budget, meaning you can't spend more than you take in. There's, of course, a lot of caveats. I've written about it a ton, about how you can move money around to pass an air quotes balanced budget, but at least states and localities can always hold this over Congress, that they pass a balanced budget, whether we're using air quotes or not. So let's start with revenue. The last several years have been very, very unique. NASBO, the National Association for State Budget Officers, their research person, described it to me as unprecedented to see double-digit revenue growth in 2 straight years. That is what has happened, but that is clearly coming to an end. Inflation plays a role, but just the slowing economy, things cannot go gangbusters forever, and nobody expected it to. The reason, of course, that states did see this and localities saw unprecedented revenue growth in 2021 and 2022 is, I'm sorry, I just noticed I have a typo on that, on the first 10 months of FY 2022, it should say 23. I'll get a corrected copy to Parker. So 2021 and 22, unprecedented growth due to federal funds flowing. Inflation played a bit of a role. Income, because the federal government spent so much relief funding, it essentially saved states and localities from making otherwise what would have been really difficult decisions. But between July and April, July of last year and April of this year, which is the first 10 months of fiscal 2023 for most states, you can tell that things are starting to come to an end. 39 states have reported declines in inflation-adjusted total tax revenues. As you can see, the overall average revenue decline is just under 6% in nominal terms, but then in inflation-adjusted terms, it's 11.6%. Inflation-adjusted personal income taxes have declined by over 20% from this time period. Corporate income taxes declined by 8%. And interestingly and tellingly, sales taxes are actually the one revenue stream that increased just slightly, but it tells you something and this is in part because the sales tax has expanded in recent years. I've got a story out today on Route 50 about how when the Wayfair Supreme Court decision came down that allowed states to collect sales taxes from remote sellers, it was like, just nobody knew it at the time, but it couldn't have come at a better time, because by the time the pandemic started and online shopping went through the roof, most states and many localities were positioned to start collecting that tax revenue. So that's one reason that sales taxes have done so well. They've also expanded it. More places have been expanding the sales tax to include other things. And so certainly states are becoming on average more reliant on the sales tax. But as you can see in some of these states, Alaska, Texas, Florida, for example, these states don't collect income taxes. And so when you're in this case, when you're less reliant on the income tax, because that is sort of the big thing that is fluctuating right now, your budget is going to be more stable. But one more quick thing before I move on to the next slide. Again, everybody knew the last few years were unprecedented. So states did not budget this year. Most states actually budgeted for less revenue, to take in less revenue in fiscal 2023 than they did in 2022. And so far, most states are kind of sliding into the end of the fiscal year, okay, budget-wise, except for California, which I'll get into. But again, coming into the current fiscal year, which is about to start in a couple of weeks, most states are again expecting even slower growth. So we saw like 10% growth, 8% growth, And now we're back down to that sort of pre-COVID, 3-4% growth at best. I want to focus a bit on California because I think what's going on here is very telling for what's going on potentially in what could be going on in other states in the future. So California is really, really reliant on the income tax. And so it is basically the first state when there is an economic downturn that typically hits higher earners first. And that shows up first in California and also New York, but New York has a different fiscal year. So because of all this, the state is facing a 31.5 billion shortfall over the next year or so. And that's to a large degree what lawmakers are arguing about. As it stands now, the legislature has passed a budget, but Governor Newsom is going to want to change some things. They're talking about that right now. But some of the big issues are, so the legislature's budget is $311 billion, and Newsom's budget is about $306 billion. So they're off by about $5 billion. One of the things they're in agreement on is how much to keep in the rainy day fund, which is a real positive. But public transit is a big touching point. So most public transit agencies, most notably in the Bay Area, are running out of money because the federal aid expires soon. And I'll get more into that on the next slide. They're asking the state to help make up the difference. The legislature has agreed to help a little bit, but Newsom's budget doesn't have any extra money for transportation agencies. Childcare is another sticking point. The legislature wants to increase childcare funding by 25%, mostly by reallocating some funds from other stuff. They also want to reduce fees that families pay to use the state's subsidized childcare programs. However, because of this budget deficit, they're working on delaying funding for about 20,000 new childcare slots next year. So that's something else that's going to have to be massaged as well. Another big point is environmental protection measures. So the way that they're getting at this shortfall is through delaying spending, as you can see with childcare, some cuts, and then borrowing. So what they are going to cut, what Newsom wants to cut, is some environmental programs, but the legislature wants to restore some of that spending. A lot of this is around recycled water programs, money to protect the coast from climate change, $204 million for parks. So there's some haggling that has to happen there too. And the reason I think California is a bellwether is because a lot of times it can be, when there's a downturn, it tends to hit California first, but it also hits California in a much more extreme way than it typically hits other places. So while this is a lot of money, a lot of stuff to deal with in California, it's not necessarily like it's going to be this difficult in other states, particularly states that don't rely as much on the income tax. But before I get onto the transit piece, I do want to point out that while I've been saying mostly negative things, there's a lot of reasons to be positive. And I think the number one reason is that states have unprecedented levels of rainy day fund reserves. So the map on the right shows you the average number of days in savings a state has. So basically, if everything shuts down now, for example, the state of Texas has enough money to operate for 61 more days before it runs out of money. So, and this is, Alaska always has a bunch, so does Wyoming, because they are very, very reliant on oil revenue, and they should have a whole lot of money set aside. But the chart the numbers on the left, though, are even more positive. So the one on the right is just what they have in their official rainy day savings. But when you add in the rest of the money that you have lying around in your funds, your fund ending balances, that increases by a whole bunch. So total across all the states, rainy day funds and their fund balances is just under $350 billion, which is the most ever. And this research is from the Pew Charitable Trusts. And that is almost a month's month longer funding than states even had a year earlier. So this is super, super key going into any expected economic downturn. And the fiscal cliff is also a piece. I'm sure most of you have heard people talking about it or have been looking into it yourselves. So I would just want to point out a couple of things about it. One is that the Volcker Alliance came out with a report earlier this year that looked at how states are spending their American Rescue Plan Act funds, or ARPA money, and whether or not they were spending them on one-time programs, which is what you would hope states do with money that they're only going to get once, is that you spend it on a one-time thing like building a bridge or that sort of thing, or paying back. Well, you can't pay back debt, but or doing something else that is not an ongoing expense. However, the Volcker Institute did find that California, Illinois, and Pennsylvania have been using sort of what the Alliance might call too high of an amount of their ARPA funding on things that are ongoing. These things, and while the Alliance does point out these three states, I will say they're not alone, but what I mean by ongoing funding, I'll give you some examples. So in Illinois, they're using their ARPA funds for just under 153 million for community support organizations, 55.8 million for a criminal justice information authority, again, ongoing funding, 50 million for trauma, mental health, and behavioral health. And so these are programs that you would want to keep going. But so the bottom line is that California, Illinois, and Pennsylvania seem to be doing this with a lot of their money, but states are doing this with at least some of their federal funding money for any number of programs. So, and the same is true for localities. I was having a conversation with a school district CFO sometime last year about what they were spending their ARPA funding on, and they were using it in part to expand mental health services at schools, to hire more counselors. And so then the question is, so how are you going to keep that funding going when the American Rescue Plan Act runs out? Because the money runs out after 2026. And so some states and localities actually do have a plan for how they're going to phase in their own funding to cover a program, but some don't. And unfortunately, the types of programs that are most often covered by ARPA funding, these types of programs that are ongoing, that are being covered by ARPA funding, tend to be the stuff that we really care about, like education, social services, housing. As I've given you examples of mental health care, trauma. I mean, these are really, really important things that, in my opinion, and other people I speak with, when you fund something and then take it away or reduce it, that hurts trust in government. And I'm going to get more into that a little bit later, but that is, to me, a really, really important thing that states and localities should be, and many of them are, looking at right now in terms of how do we keep this going, whether it's reallocating funding from something else or what. But again, this is all happening as we're going back into a more kind of normal, slow revenue growth cycle. So that is something else to be balanced in the mix as well. The other piece of the ARPA fiscal cliff I want to focus on is transit. To me, this is the most concerning major, pick a word, thing that has yet to be solved, and a solution is not in sight. And what I mean by that is, so I think, as we all know, transit ridership has not returned to pre-pandemic levels, nor is it expected to recover. It's now at about 70% of pre-pandemic levels, but that's a national figure. When you look at major cities like Washington, D.C.'s WMATA, ridership is stuck at 50% of pre-pandemic levels. BART in San Francisco area is around 40%. And that system is particularly reliant on tech workers. So that kind of makes sense. The more people you have had riding transit that now have access to remote work, the more the transit system is going to suffer. So this is indeed connected with remote work. I think in the beginning of the pandemic, people thought, oh, well, ridership is down because people are concerned about the health effects or that sort of thing. But as we have settled into what I don't even want to call it the new normal, but as we have settled into this new era of remote work and work flexibility, mass transit is sort of an unintended casualty of that. And the problem is that most people who rely most on mass transit tend to be wage workers and who are lower income in the service industry. And so the folks who are relying on it most are the people who can least afford for mass transit to become more expensive if you raise fares, or for service cuts, because that affects their quality of life, that affects their ability to get to their job. And so from a pure equity standpoint, you don't want to do that either. And so there's been lots of warning. Credit agencies are all over this. I have a quote from S&P Global Ratings, but essentially what I think is going to end up happening is that governments are going to have to subsidize mass transit even more than they already do. And in large cities, this is kind of the multi-million dollar or billion-dollar question, because large cities tend to rely more on fare revenue mass transit operators in large cities tend to rely the most on fare revenue, more so than mass transit operators in mid-sized or smaller cities. And when your fare revenue is going down because of ridership, that's what's creating these huge gaps. And so in California, for example, sorry, I keep going back to it must be my bias. I grew up there. But it's a good example for problems. So in California, mass transit operators have asked the state, have crunched the numbers and have looked at what kind of deficit they're looking at when their mass transit federal funding ends. And the number is around $6 billion. So what they did is they made some cuts and have asked the legislature for $5 billion in aid, which is still obviously a lot of money. They're doing this at a time, as we know, when California is facing a budget deficit. So that complicates things even further. And as I noted earlier, Governor Newsom isn't even considering putting more money into mass transit. I would be super shocked if the ultimate budget that was passed didn't provide extra funding for mass transit. So Newsom's number is 0 right now. The legislature, though, was supportive, but what their budget included was around $3 billion or so for mass transit. So you started at a $6 billion deficit. The operators cut it through cuts, asked for $5 billion to help cover it, and the legislature gave them $3 billion. So clearly, while states are going to be asked to help stopgap these budget deficits, they're not going to be able to provide enough. So I don't have any answers, but this is going to be a really, really big issue for large transit systems in major cities, which are looking at a lot of remote workers in downtowns. Which cities, you might ask? Let's get on to the next slide. So
just a real quick, hey Liz, just a real quick thing on the mass transit before you leave that. I think it was Kansas City, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago, that went to basically a 0 fare model. They said, hey guys, we're just going to make the whole thing across the board. Do you see anybody else trying that out from both an equity as well as, as you know this stuff better than anybody, is the whole death spiral, you cut service, and then less people take it because it's not available, and then your ride becomes 2 hours instead of 1 hour, and it just feeds on itself. So has anybody else thought about doing that?
Yes, and
I know it's hard, it's a lot of money, but again, whatever.
Yeah, well, interestingly, so Kansas City was able to do that with their their rail line, which is very limited. And they also have something going on with their bus lines as well. It is a
Yeah.
lot cheaper to subsidize fares on bus lines.
Yep.
And when you have a really limited rail line, Kansas City crunched the numbers and figured out it's not really going to cost us that much to make it free. So that's what they did. In major cities, Washington, D.C. is one, are looking at free or reduced or very, very reduced fares for low income riders. I think DC's pilot program has even started now where bus riders can get a reduced fare. I think they are looking at that or considering it for WMATA, for the DC Metro, certainly not a free fare, but a reduced fare. And that's sort of the thing. It's a lot harder to do a free fare on a major rail system, but I would expect that a reduced fare for lower income riders would be something that more places kind of look to in terms of that equity piece. But again, that transit systems like that are going to have to shift away from their reliance on fare revenue and look to other things. Okay, did that. So the cities that I mentioned, Washington, D.C., as you can see, let me go through this chart here. So this is some work I did for the Rockefeller Institute last year. You'll notice it says telework trends in 15 metro areas. I only included the top 3. This is a remote work report I did that came out last year that looked at what the levels have ended up at, because they were, of course, very, very high at the beginning of the pandemic. But they have since, I have found, kind of evened out to a sort of normal in the later months of 2022. And so what we have here is if you look on the very right-hand column, telework August 2022, that's when this particular data point is taken. There was probably more recent data than this now. But Washington, D.C., Seattle, and San Francisco all have very high, much higher than average, and the national average is in cities, not states, much higher than average levels of people still working remotely. The more remote work tends to coincide with cities that have higher income earners. And again, if you look all the way to the left, the median household income in these cities is much higher than the national average. They also tell it does not necessarily correlate interest, which sort of surprised me, with how long a commute is. I sort of thought at the beginning, like I live outside of the DC area, and I'm also familiar with the San Francisco area, and I know the commutes there are just horrible, but that didn't necessarily seem to coincide because in Dallas and Houston, for example, the levels of remote work aren't as high, and those commutes are terrible too. So the length of commute is not so much a factor, but reliance on public transportation does correlate a little bit with places that tend to have a higher population of remote workers. And then, and as you can see in the teleworking 2019 column, there's another kind of correlating factor is whether there was a higher than normal or higher than average percentage of people already reporting that they worked from home before the pandemic. And so these are just some of the things that kind of contribute to this issue for downtowns. And again, it's going to be in the downtowns that have higher income earners, that have a major transit system that people used to rely on, and other factors like type of employment, of course. Basically, if you're a white collar worker, then you probably are more likely to have access to remote work. And these numbers might make it look a little bit scarier than it is in reality. So telework is defined as worked from home at least one day in the previous 2 weeks. So you could have a worker in San Francisco, Washington, D.C. saying, yes, I teleworked, but they teleworked on Wednesdays and were in the office every other day. And so this doesn't mean that half of Washington, D.C.'s daytime population has decreased by 50% since before the pandemic. That's not quite what this means, but the numbers are high enough that they are very, very significant. And so these downtowns in particular are also dealing with a housing crisis, with a homeless higher homeless, with housing insecure, and other factors that make are forcing them to sort of rethink how they get revenue from their downtowns. I mean, the old model of really tall buildings with a lot of office workers, that you can count on for those real estate property taxes, that is kind of sliding away. And a couple of years ago, when the pandemic was still relatively in the early stages, a lot of people thought that well, those office leases last years. By then things will have normalized, and those offices will fill up again. There's no need for a company to not renew its lease. We're seeing that's not the case. And so one thing to really watch out for in downtowns is how are cities going to recreate a sense of place in their downtown. On the next slide, this is sort of one way that cities aren't struggling. And this also kind of speaks to the desire to create that sense of place. So this is a quote taken from a Brookings piece that was on the Brookings Institution website. And it says LA and other cities are recovering, but not their downtowns. And I just showed you one of the reasons why. But Tracy writes, not at the office or on the train. Instead, people are enjoying walkable mixed-use neighborhoods where they can both live and work, in contrast to the 20th century model of cities and suburbs that rigidly separates work zones from other activities. So people, live, work, and play has been like the thing of the mantra of all housing developers in all of these little kind of pop-up communities and suburbs. But to be sure, it's something that people want no matter where they live. And so recreating that sense of place downtown for cities will likely mean figuring out how to properly subsidize and incentivize converting that office space, maybe not Class A, but some of the Class B and C office space, into housing units to also address their incredibly problematic affordable housing issues. That is a math problem that I don't have the answer to, but that's something that I know a lot of people are trying to figure out. And something else too, but so that's housing is one aspect of it, but you also want to have, in order to attract people who want to live somewhere, you have to have those cultural amenities. Downtowns have the advantage of already having them, so that box is kind of checked, but there's also things like parks, schools, grocery stores, those sorts of other quality of life type things that people want to have within a reasonable radius of where they live. And so that's something else in terms of zoning and parks funding that cities will have to think about. This little tab I have on the right refers to some research done also out of Brookings that talks about that looked at this, that sought to answer, okay, cities like to give and states like to give tax breaks to corporations to bring them here to then create jobs and then help the economy. But essentially what his research showed was that the economy is actually better helped when you invest in quality of life services, the types of things that attract people to want to live there and have a job and give you their tax and become a taxpayer. Things like education, of course, again, parks, just anything that we would all like about where we live. And a lot of that stuff is publicly funded, especially when you think about healthcare, schools, and recreation. That is all city and county funding type stuff. And so all that to say is that those are the kinds of things I think cities are going to be kind of contemplating more than they did before the pandemic. It's not just about attracting, what do we do about the businesses? It's what do we do about making people want to live here again? Last sort of big theme I am watching is climate risk. And one of the things that concerns me about this is that the cities that can afford to pay for what they need to do to adapt to climate change will do so. The American Council for an Energy Efficient Economies Clean Energy Scorecard comes out every year. And the last one that I was able to snag rated San Francisco, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. Those cities are coming up a lot as the top 3. Bottom 3 are Baton Rouge in Louisiana, Wichita in Kansas, and Cape Coral. Not refers to the fact that these bottom ranked cities all have a much lower economic output compared with these top ranked cities. They also, 2 of them at least, are minority cities as well. And so that what this means is that if you have the money, if you're a city where there's a lot of people with high incomes, you have the economic wherewithal to do what you need to do, to go to the market, to apply for that federal funding, whatever it is, to at least put yourself in a position to be adaptable to climate change and whatever it's going to bring. These cities without the financial means, essentially, and without the economic means, are not going to be as adaptable. And so that is, it kind of creates it increases the divide between those who have things going for them and those who have not. And we're talking about risk of population loss and that kind of thing. Again, on climate risk, I just want to talk about that by highlighting what's going on in Florida. So real quick, when I talk about climate risk, I'm talking about a municipality or state's vulnerability to the effects of climate change. And so Florida is a good example. Sorry, I'm pulling up my notes again, because it, in my opinion, is one of the states that is most state budgets that is most vulnerable to climate events. And so what happened last year with Hurricane Ian, I think, could be a turning point in terms of how kind of all in Florida is on making sure that people still live there, even through all the hurricane events. The big issue, of course, is around home insurance. Insurers have been leaving the state because it doesn't make any business sense for them to insure a house there anymore. This has been happening for many years. As such, the state has established the Citizens Property Insurance Corporation, and it's meant to be the insurer of last resort for people who can't find private coverage. It has been taking on more and more people, so much so that some people think it's going to be the primary insurer of homeowners in Florida in the coming years. The state also funds a hurricane catastrophe fund that essentially kind of provides reinsurance to these small insurers and does other things to incentivize the private insurance market to stay in the state. So it is putting billions into these types of things. And so what that means is that Hurricane Ian, the reason I say it is a turning point is because, investors may start demanding higher yields from issuers like Florida that have significant climate risk and are putting public funds into not combating climate change, but keeping the status quo. There's a huge difference between something like this and something like incentivizing or shoring up a coastline or anything like that, where you're doing something to be adaptable to climate change instead of just paying to rebuild. And so when I talk to people who look at the municipal market, this is something that comes up more and more, is that investors are really concerned that states and localities aren't giving this kind of thing enough ink in their reports. Particularly, so some of you may know of a company called Municipal Market Analytics, and they wrote a piece last year that pointed out these risks in Florida and in other places. They think the SEC could even start cracking down on municipalities that don't properly assess climate risk in their municipal market disclosures. They point out that Cape Coral, which was hit hard by Hurricane Ian, and again was on that previous slide of not having done much to be adaptable to climate change. So Cape Coral was hit hard by Hurricane Ian. It issued general obligation bonds the year before in 2021. And its disclosure on climate risks is barely more than boilerplate, despite the fact that the community's history of being of being uniquely susceptible to disaster is well documented. So this is something, again, that I hear people in the municipal market talk a lot about, and some issuers are really in tune to this and others aren't. So those are the main issues. To wrap up, I want to point out a couple of other issues. I have not mentioned the staffing crisis and some other things. I think that there are certain things that we kind of just accept as what's going on, but there are these sort of side issues that are a result of a lot of the things that I just talked about that I think also play into the outlook for states and localities. So one of them is trust. I spoke about that earlier. Um, Trust and public finance are inextricably linked. People don't trust you when you start spending their money in ways that they don't like, or ways that is not transparent, or ways that is ineffective. And so trust and public finance trust in government is waning. And that directly affects how elected officials can budget money and do their jobs if their constituents don't trust them to do so. Technology is just, I feel like it's sort of a blanket issue, but in this particular case, there are two reasons why I want to kind of hone in on it. One is that I think it's going to be the solution for the staffing crisis that is happening in states and particularly localities. There's a lot of purpose-built solutions that have come up, particularly since the pandemic started, but this was something that was already starting before that. So a lot of these companies are trying to mold their solutions around to what's going on, what the need is in state and local government. But a lot of that is being driven by the need for governments to be able to do their jobs or even better with fewer workers. And in addition, the federal funding, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which offer billions and billions and billions of dollars in different types of funding, also can not only help fund the type of technology that governments will need to buy, and it makes it a priority for governments to do so with so many programs that are focused on water conservation, with reducing emissions. All of that is going to be related to some kind of tech solution for governments. And the last piece is workplace happiness. And again, that's kind of related to the staffing crisis. But what I see going on in governments is governments will not match the private sector on salary. I think we all know that. I think they have been giving raises, but they should not be giving raises to try to match the private sector on salary, because that's just not something that's going to happen. Related to that, in terms of keeping workers happy or attracting workers, is that they can't rely on most of them can't rely on their pension benefits anymore either. Following the Great Recession, a lot of places cut those benefits for new workers, or got rid of their pension plan entirely. And so new workers are coming in on something that is more like a 401k, although still governments are pretty generous with those plans compared to the private sector. But that's not something that they can lean on either. It used to be that, oh, we have low salaries, but we make up for it in benefits in retirement. And that is just not the case anymore. So that's not something they can do. But what they can do is foster an environment where people can grow and thrive and live. And that, of course, is true for any employer. But governments have a unique advantage, because particularly the generation that's coming out of college now is all about jobs with purpose. I mean, that is one of the defining things of that generation. And governments have that all over the place. And they can outmatch the private sector, outdo the private sector on that front. And they can also offer more generous work-life balance benefits. They can do things like help with student debt. They can offer childcare, or help subsidize childcare. These are things that governments have a little bit more ability to do, and many are starting to turn to that too. Remote work, again, is going to be an aspect of that as well. There are still some local governments that think that they don't need to offer people the ability to work from home sometimes, because it's about seeing you and being in the office. I disagree with that. And the workers I've spoken to who are in those situations also strongly disagree. And so I think local governments are still kind of figuring out where they want to be on that. But that is definitely a factor in terms of workplace happiness, is being able to offer that flexibility. If governments can't offer the flexibility of place, they can certainly and are offering a flexibility of schedule. So that's kind of the layout for states and localities. And I just want to wrap up with some points. So reasons to be optimistic are, I've gone over a lot of this stuff. So federal relief and the unprecedented amount of federal funding that is available in the coming years, decade, is going to be absolutely huge. And it is, and local and state governments are taking advantage of that as much as they possibly can. The pandemic also led to a much more quicker adoption and outlook about adopting new technology than I think would have happened otherwise. And that includes AI. That's going to be really key when we think about the need to have technology be able to do the jobs of government workers that are not coming back. And last, as we started off talking about, at least there's federal budget stability for at least another 2 years, which means stability for state and local governments, at least in that sense. There aren't going to be, hopefully, huge federal funding cuts for these domestic programs that states rely on and that localities rely on through their states to be able to provide services to their constituents. Things I want to watch out for is that staffing crisis again. I think there are two things about it that have me worried. One is that a lot of local governments have fear of missing out, that they are not going to be able to take full advantage of all of the federal programs and apply for everything they want to, because they just don't have the capacity to manage it. The staffing shortage, particularly in state and local finance departments, is leading to delays in financial reporting. And just recently, S&P Ratings withdrew its rating for about 60 or so local governments because of that very reason, because they were late on their on their annual financial reports. So that is a huge issue to definitely watch. Slowing revenues are coming during a major election year, and usually lawmakers like to pass tax cuts in major election years. Doing it at a time when revenues are slow is very problematic. So that's something to keep an eye on. And then last, just the worsening politicization of climate change. We've seen all these anti-ESG bills coming out in several states, but I think particularly in Texas and Florida. Florida has part of its bill prohibits local governments from contracting with rating agencies that use ESG in their scoring. The wording of that is not very clear. But the point is that the states, because of the politicization of climate change and that particular state's government's stance on it, it is affecting what local governments can actually do for their own credit quality. And just the political polarization in general, that used to be something that didn't really trickle down to the local level, but it definitely has, and in a lot of places, and it's contributing in part to staff burnout in some places, and even some local officials either resigning or deciding not to run again because they feel like it's not worth it. So that is a lot. I left very little time for questions. But I just want to leave this screen up a little bit. So in case, I have a newsletter called Long Story Short that comes out every week. And in it, you can read a lot about all of the things I just talked about and more. And so if you have your phone handy, you can use that QR code to subscribe for free. And that is also all of my information, which again, will be in the PDF that you receive after this. So I will stop sharing now. Hand it back to you, Parker.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending. A couple quick things before we wrap up here. Liz, Maria Garnett, who actually just looks like she just left, but she shared, I guess in Richmond, Virginia, they one of those small, medium cities that went through a fare free program. And they've actually seen pandemic increase in ridership during the period. I guess in Richmond, Virginia, she says, and that's supposed to be universal through at least June of 25. So at least
That's great.
That's one city that's at least trying it out. And I guess somebody asked, and I think you answered the question, but just make sure on that hybrid, on on the remote, what cities are remote versus not. I think you answered the question that remote meant at least 1 day per week outside of the office, not full time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, no, that's great stuff. And obviously in the summary that you guys are all going to get, we'll have the QR code in there as well as a link to subscribe. So you'll be able to get that. I put the presentation in the chat. It'll also be in the email that'll go out. So you'll get it that way as well. And, I think I say this in every one of these things we do with you guys. I mean, if you guys ever have topics you guys think would be interesting, let us know. We'll go out, we'll find speakers. I mean, that's my thing on these deals is how can we get you guys information? I mean, that's really what this is. Kind of Liz's point about, public sector employee staffing issues. You guys saw we launched our public sector profile series a little while ago to try and highlight that, to kind of bring some visibility to it, because public sector jobs don't get the same level of play as say Google and Amazon do. So we're trying to, do what we can to publicize the concept. And do what we can to share those stories. And, to Liz's point about the political polarization, you've seen that in probably some of these profiles we've done that you hear people talking about. The staff who are just trying to do their job are getting, beat up's a strong word, but dealing with a lot of grief that they shouldn't have to deal with. And they're just sitting at the teller window, trying to do their job.
Mhm.
And so that's a lot of stuff people are dealing with. I don't have the answers, but it's kind of stuff we all got to worry about. And even to the telework or remote stuff, I know we have one of our clients, a very high cost of living place. And I don't know how you do this, but the issue is going, well, do you allow people to work out of state? Let's say your town is in Massachusetts, but do you allow somebody to work in Nebraska at your town? What does that mean for things like, unemployment tax and stuff, because you're a municipality? And so all kinds of joyous issues we never had to deal with back in the day. So these are all the kind of things that I know you guys are all dealing with. And again, you guys have topics, let us know. We'll find speakers. That's kind of why we're here. And again, thank you so much, Liz, for coming out and sharing this information. I know there's a lot of stuff here, and I know you guys are, we'll do whatever we can. You have questions afterwards, reach out, we'll get them answered for you. We'll send the email out, you get the video. And if there's anything we can do, you guys let us know. All right, thank you all. We very much appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, all right, bye guys.